recorded lectures for ML103. This is the Shieldmaiden, Fantasy and Reality. So obviously this lecture is connected to your tutorial readings for this particular set of weeks. I thought it would be useful to have some background on just the reality and the fiction of female warriors in Viking Age Scandinavia. I had to throw in a picture of Lagertha. She's such an iconic figure. When you think of a shield maiden, she's who pops into mind in modern popular culture, so she had to appear at some point here. So shield maidens are an easily recognizable part of Viking warrior culture in the popular imagination. They're very much like the berserker in that way. It's an element we expect in representations of Viking culture. Now, what's interesting is that they are actually often conflated with Valkyries and other female warriors in heroic poems, in skaldic poems, even in Snorri's Edda. Somewhere they don't show up very often are the Icelandic sagas. Women in Icelandic sagas basically have their own issues. They can be represented in a variety of ways. Sometimes they're a lone warrior. Sometimes they're members of small bands. Oftentimes these are bands of female warriors. They are sometimes integrated into regular fighting forces, and in other cases, they actually assume positions of command. There is often something transgressive about their appearance. So they might wear male clothing. They might also fight without armor. Now, what's quite interesting is that sometimes, when you look at the literary representations of shield maidens, becoming a shield maiden means a change in name. And we also see changes in the way vocabulary is used to describe them. So after they adopt this way of life, oftentimes the masculine form of words is used while discussing them. You shouldn't assume this to mean that they become men or anything like that. There have been some scholars who've argued that the shield maiden or the Valkyrie is essentially a third gender, somewhere in between male and female. I'm not sure I buy that, but there are reasons to suggest it, certainly. Now, what's really interesting is that they can be portrayed as both remarkable exceptions to what normal women were capable of doing, but they can also be portrayed in a way that suggests there's nothing unusual about them at all. So, for quite some time, it was assumed that the representation of the shield maiden was purely literary in nature. Obviously, the question of whether there were actually women warriors in the Viking Age is something very separate. Now, we're going to look at the famous grave from Birka separately. That's the one that was covered in that article that I signed you to read. But a few general points should be made. First of all, there are other graves besides the one at Birka, where osteology has suggested that the occupant is female, where there are also weapons found. 15 of these graves have single axes. There are a few more with spears or knives, arrows, sometimes a shield. They don't really compare to the graves with full weapon sets, so they wouldn't necessarily have ever been interpreted as warrior graves. There are only a handful of other graves with full weapon sets where the possibility is that the occupant was female. Now, that being said, have to acknowledge this. The presence of weapons in graves doesn't necessarily make the occupant a warrior, but nor does their absence make them not a warrior. Remember when we talked about Scandinavian funeral practices and how fluid they were and how diverse they were? How can we ever generalize about what a specific type of grave good might actually mean? It could mean something completely different, in northern Norway versus southern Denmark. Now, it's also unlikely that there were hordes of female warriors in medieval Scandinavia. Let's just be honest. Physically speaking, in most cases, women are not going to do as well in hand-to-hand combat with edged weapons as men are. That's just realism. Men are bigger, stronger, have greater upper body strength, and that matters when you're swinging an axe around. But that is a generalization, right? That does not include the fact that there are always outliers. Exceptional women, physically exceptional women, have always existed. Now, if you put an exceptional female fighter against a poor or mediocre male opponent, she's going to kick his ass in most cases. Now, of course, it's a bit different if you have an exceptional female fighter versus an exceptional male fighter. But, there are women who would be capable of competing on this particular playing field. Perhaps not many, but there would be some. The other thing to keep in mind is that in a society like medieval Scandinavia, where the men were so often away raiding, it would have been left to the women to defend the farm if it needed defending. So we have to keep in mind that many Scandinavian women would have had to learn how to defend themselves and their families, because sometimes you're the only one there who's able to do it. So what we can conclude, I think, is that there were almost certainly female warriors amongst the Vikings. Perhaps not many, but they would have been there. All right, so let's talk about the Birka grave. So this is a 10th century chamber grave found in an urban cemetery at Birka in Sweden. Birka was a trading outpost. The occupant of the cemetery was dressed very richly. They were buried, seated, and accompanied by a full weapon set and 2 horses. The weapons were very impressive. There was an axe blade, spearheads, a 2-edged sword, arrows with shafts that were embellished with silver thread. There was a sax knife or a seax in a bronze-ringed sheath. They found iron bosses that clearly came from a round shield. The body of the shield is usually wood, so it would have rotted away. A knife, a whetstone, and also additional personal goods. Game pieces, which is unusual and significant. A bronze bowl, a comb, silver coins, trader's weights, stirrups, bridles, spikes for riding your horse on the ice. The clothing had largely rotted away, but what remained was interesting. There's an iron cloak pin, sort of a filigreed silver cone, what looks like buttons made out of coiled silver wire, strips of silk embroidered in silver, and a handful of mirrored sequins. It was originally excavated in 1878 and was sort of publicized as the grave of a high-status warrior from the mid-900s, the ultimate Viking, as Price mentions. It was designated BJ 581, and that is the actual skeleton in the image there. So in 2002, a scholar made an argument based on the remains of the clothing that this was actually a cavalry commander under the authority of a royal war leader. It was a fairly well-supported argument. There was an important bit about a cap that was Russian, as in Kievan Rus, as in Eastern Vikings, in nature. However, in 2011, modern osteology gets a say and says this is a woman, or this is at least a female skeleton. Genetic analysis in 2017 confirmed that the person indeed had 2 X chromosomes. And this kicks off an enormous debate. Not so much about the Birka warrior themselves, but about why Viking studies for so long tended to make gender-based assumptions and whether scholars needed to reevaluate how they do that. And the answer is yes, they absolutely do need to reevaluate how they do that. So we have to remember a couple of things about this person. There is the possibility that they are not a female warrior. The occupant of the grave may be transgender, maybe non-binary, maybe gender fluid. All of these are possible identities. We can consider them all without thinking that we know for sure. I mean, if you're going to go for the simplest explanation, yeah, she's a female warrior. But there are other possibilities out there. And given some of the interesting sort of gender representations in Scandinavian literature, we are, I would say, ethically required to make sure we take that into account. Blurring the line between sex and gender just threatens to obscure the many different potential realities here, and that would be a shame. Now, we don't know what choices this person made and how they perceived of their own identity. As I mentioned, some of the later literary texts that deal with female warriors do talk about them choosing new names when they set out on that path, and there are things about that that we can't really grasp because we simply don't have access to that particular cultural mindset. Now, the reevaluation that all of this kicked off, I think, was vital, but it's been a bit fraught. There are a number of scholars And a number of people who are not scholars but who are still interested in this debate, who are very, very deeply invested in denying that women ever played any kind of a martial role in a society like that of medieval Scandinavia. You can't have female warriors. You absolutely cannot. They simply can't exist. They're fantasy figures. The shieldmaiden is a fantasy. The Scythian horse archer, who also happened to be female, was a fantasy. I wish I understood why the pushback against this idea is so strong. And it's not just with the Vikings. As I said, it's a big deal with the Scythians as well, as osteology reveals that more of our warrior graves over on that side of the world are in fact graves that have female occupants. It almost seems a bit pathological at times. Like there are just people who cannot accept that there may have been female warriors. Now, back to the Birka grave, however. One of the things that Price and his co-authors point out is that a lot of work has been actually done on the material culture of the elite warrior class in Birka. And this grave really fits down to that Eastern influence from the Rus. The location of the grave was also important because it's outside the gates of the hill fort, near two other burials with weapons. And what they're getting at here is that this identification from 2002, that this was a high-ranking warrior, it's plausible. It's not definite, but it's plausible, just based on what's in the grave and where the grave is. So that opens up quite some interesting speculation about the identity of the Birka warrior. Okay, so I thought it might be worth spending a little bit of time talking about what the actual traditional view of Scandinavian women from this period was and where it came from. So traditionally speaking, women in Scandinavian culture in the Middle Ages have been seen as inhabiting a separate sphere. They supposedly were within the house. They were in charge of childcare, cooking, service tasks related to milk and wool. The man on the other side of things looks after the world beyond. So fishing, agriculture, herding, travel, trade, politics, and the law. The traditional narrative reflects the ideal nature of Scandinavian society as it is laid out in their law codes from the Central and Late Middle Ages. The gender binary is a very key part of how these laws see society as it should be. Does it actually reflect what's going on the ground? Of course not. I say this as a legal historian, or at least somebody who was a legal historian at the beginning of her career. Laws never reflect perfectly what's going on the ground. Laws lay forward an ideal. At the best, sometimes laws react to what's going on the ground. And there are so many holes in this idea of the woman within the house. So there are tasks, everyday tasks, that would have brought women outside. And this is important. This defies the traditional narrative. So we know that they plucked and sheared fleece, that they washed clothes. They were in charge of the animals in areas where animal husbandry was a major part of the economy. They would do things like lead the animals to their summer pastures. They would need to work on preserving and conserving dairy products. That's not something you do inside the house. They worked in the fields in more agriculturally based areas, especially during the harvest. Now, in regions where economic activity further away, so whether that was raiding or fishing, required the absence of men, women would have to take on an even larger role in farming. We know that in areas that were colonized late in the Viking Age, women sowed and threshed grain. They gathered berries, nuts, eggs, and seaweed. Now, if you lost your husband, you could farm on after their death. You would often have to remarry, especially if you had small children to be looked after, but that didn't mean you gave up your property. Now, it's also worth noting that even within this so-called gender binary, women would still have held great power. They're in charge, especially if it's a wealthy household. It's almost like a company, and she's the CEO. Now, traditionally speaking, one of the symbols of the woman's authority in the household in the Viking period has been designated the keys that she supposedly carried at her waist. She carries the keys to the house, all the things that go on in the house. The problem is that the image of a housewife carrying keys does not exist in the Viking Age. Of 150 Icelandic sagas, we have one from the 13th century that refers to a housewife's keys. There is a 13th century marriage law from Denmark that refers to a bride being given to her husband, and one of the statements within the law is for lock and keys. There is an also 13th century poem about Thor who had to cross-dress as a bride and actually happened to have keys at his waist. These are the only references to housewives with keys in the literary sources. One reference, one law, one god in drag. Now, if you compare that to the sheer number of women with weapons who are depicted in the literary sources, one scholar points out you have 20 warrior women in sagas and histories, you have 53 in poems and myths. You have an early Icelandic law book from the 13th century that calls women bearing weapons a threat to society. Now, here's an example of a law that probably does reflect society. You don't legislate against something that only happens in fiction. You legislate something you see against something you see as a problem in your own society. So there are clearly women carrying weapons in Iceland in the 13th century. So where does this all come from? It's the Victorians. It's the 19th century. The 19th century has so much to answer for. It always, always has. So we have talked about the, sort of huge popularization of the Vikings during the Victorian period. Now think about Victorian women. Upper class women are confined to the home in this period. They're limited to home-based duties. It's not the case for middle class and lower class women, of course, but as per usual, we see people who gets talked about upper class women always. The iconic Viking housewife with her keys at her belt is first discussed in a Swedish history book from the 1860s. Now, do we actually find keys in graves from this period? Yeah, we have from Norway 143 keys, half of them from female graves, half of them from male graves. In comparison, 3,000 swords have been found in Norwegian graves from this period. So basically, we are thinking like Victorians with the gender binary, or we have been thinking like Victorians. So we've got to be very cautious about how we deal with this traditional narrative. I mean, yes, on one hand, many women in medieval Scandinavia would have played roles within the household. Were they strictly limited to the household? Almost certainly not. Were there women who went beyond those roles and beyond even the understandable extension of those roles? Yes, almost certainly there were. The reality of Viking Age gender roles is probably far more complicated than we're ever going to be able to see clearly, and the reason for that is that they've been obscured, first of all, by the Christian influence of the later sagas, and then again by the Christian framing of post-medieval reception of Viking culture. So it is unfortunate, and it's not going to be solved unless we start coming up with more archaeological evidence, which is always a possibility. All right, so I want to wrap up by talking about the Valkyries, since I said that the shieldmaiden and the Valkyrie are often conflated, and the Valkyrie is another literary example of a female warrior. So the Valkyries are seen in written sources from the 9th century to the 14th century, and, well, beyond that, to be fair, as well. They're very clearly a significant part of Viking Age iconography, but our understanding of them is somewhat obscured by popular myth and perceptions. We have talked about how they serve Odin. They choose the warriors who die in battle. They serve as hostesses in the Hall of Valhalla. They are traditionally depicted as armed women, riding their horses through the sky. There's a lovely bit from one poem about the dew on the grass being the sweat that falls from the flanks of their steeds. They carry spears, swords, and shields. They sometimes wear helmets along with their mail. They also sometimes wear the skins or wings of swans, which allows them to fly on their own. Now, if you look at later literary sources, they are sometimes depicted as falling in love with individual human heroes, They protect them in combat, that sort of thing. And this is characteristic of what gets done with the Valkyries. We so often see them through the male gaze. They are beautiful women wearing weapons, sometimes wearing very little but weapons. And this actually comes from the Christian take on them in the Middle Ages. Clerical writers in particular loved to see them as these lovelorn heroines. In some of the heroic poems, they actually rescue their human boyfriends, as I said, or in the worst case scenario, they keep them company in their graves. It's a bit gross, but you do you, Valkyries. If you compare that to what Neil Price calls the primal Valkyries, it's very different. The primal Valkyries don't swoop down on the battlefield to scoop up heroes and carry them away to Valhalla. They are unleashed on the battlefield. There are 52 named Valkyries and many others who don't have individual names who are part of collectives. And if you translate their names, they represent aspects of fighting and battle. So you've got names like Battle Weaver, Shaker, Disorder, Victory Froth, Sword Noise, Howling, Killer, Teeth Grinder, Devastator, Silence, and so forth. Early depictions of the Valkyries do not portray them as physically attractive, but terrifying. There's a great quote from the Saga of the Volsungs, and it says, "Looking at them was like gazing into flames." They were actually mesmerizing, but frightening at the same time. And they're also connected in some way to the Norns. So there is a kind of obscure poem called The Web of Spears from the 10th or 11th century. And it talks about the narrator seeing a group of Valkyries go inside a cottage. And he takes a peek inside, and what he sees is shocking to him. They are weaving on a loom made of human body parts. They're creating cloth that is made out of entrails dyed with blood. They are using their weapons as tools. And as they are weaving, they are singing a song that makes it clear to the narrator that in fact what they're doing, this weaving, is determining the outcome of a battle somewhere else. And when the cloth is finished, they tear it to shreds and ride off with the scraps. So I want you to think about that image and think about what it says about Scandinavian ideas, about what happens when you combine a female identity with martial prowess or martial skill or just simply a martial role. There's something deeper and more complex and wilder going on here than, the buxom blonde Valkyrie with her horned helmet that we see from opera and that sort of thing. Now, Assassin's Creed Valhalla's picture that it gives us of gender-balanced raiding crews is not reality. It's not. We have no evidence whatsoever that, half of a longship's crew would be female. Do we have evidence that there were not female members of raiding crews? Of course we don't. It is entirely possible that there were. And certainly once we get on into the settlement period in the British Isles, it's very hard to tell, who was an actual member of a raiding party, who just happened to have been along when the raiding party got slaughtered. Because there are skeletons, bodies that are identified as female that show up in things like mass graves. So I would argue that the real Viking warrior woman still exists just out of our view. And the best we can do is to kind of keep reaching for her, to try and understand her, and to keep an open mind as to the nature of the evidence that we have at our disposal. It's a really interesting topic, and hope you enjoyed this. So I'll be back with another one shortly.